with Vietnam, I know that President Obama had signed a declaration for the commemoration of the 50-year recognition, and I've worked on products to help with that in the past. But with this documentary, why now? Why Vietnam now?
We've been working on this for more than a decade, so in some ways we began it in 2006, before Barack Obama decided to run for president, or announced that he was running for president, and then served out 2 terms and left for the next person. So we feel that the Vietnam War is the most important event in American history since the Second World War, that it is unfinished business for most Americans, and I think for many veterans, very much that unfinished business, and that we've tried to tell a complicated story that requires people sort of giving up maybe their hardened positions about what they think happened and yield to what we've learned actually happened, and to see the points of view of different people. But I think in that way, if we do that, this can be an extraordinary welcome home for veterans. These are people who came home alone, who sort of took off their uniforms and tried to blend, and people didn't want to deal with it. It was an unpleasant situation for Americans. We don't lose wars. And I think what happens is a good deal of the disunion we experience today, the lack of civil discourse, sort of began in the Vietnam era, and it may be possible by figuring out what actually did happen and getting the variety of perspectives that it is possible to get, that we may be able to serve those veterans in a way we have not been able to serve them before. I think people who see this film will stop saying that complete dead end, thank you for your service, and may be able to say, welcome home, what can we do for you?
You know, we were at an event last night with Secretary of State John Kerry, Senator John McCain, and Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, all Vietnam veterans, and several of them were involved in the process of normalization of relations between America and Vietnam, which took 10 years. And one of them was saying that why they pursued that goal, which was really interesting to hear, was because they thought it would help us at home to heal the rifts that Ken is talking about, that we could normalize relations with Vietnam, we could think about the future and not the past. And so our countries have done that kind of on a geopolitical level, you know, on a diplomatic level and on an organizational level, but we at home in America really haven't normalized our relations among ourselves between veterans and the people who didn't serve, and the people who protested the war, and the people, families were divided. It was an extremely wrenching and difficult time. And one of the veterans in the film says that coming home was as traumatic as fighting in the war. And that's not so usual for other wars. It's difficult to come home from any war, but this war in particular, veterans really suffered, like Ken is saying. And we hope the film will actually begin a kind of a normalization here that we've had with the nation of Vietnam.
And I hear that from veterans who have taken the trip, that have met with Vietnam, with North Vietnamese who they've been in dogfights with, in Vietnam, in their land, that have found reconciliation.
Well, you wish human beings would be smart enough to skip to the reconciliation and avoid the war part, but that's not going to happen. But you're absolutely right. The normalization of relationships between the two countries has permitted this extraordinary exchange to take place. But not only are we unsettled about the war here, they're unsettled about their war there. They expended huge amounts of manpower. They just put them into this meat grinder and said, we will not count the cost. We find the 58,000 dead intolerable for a country much, much bigger than Vietnam, and they suffered millions of losses. And so they're now wrestling with very deep existential questions. How do we relate to the people who remain from the other country that disappeared, South Vietnam, the losers? How do we, the winners, understand this not as some top-down party line about the glorious struggle, but in fact a realization of the sacrifice that was made, and then all the attendant questions that come with that. Was that sacrifice necessary? Could it have been achieved with negotiations earlier? Could we have asked for half a loaf and ended up with all of these other human lives still around? And so I think that we can learn from their tumult just as they are beginning to learn. We talked to a North Vietnamese soldier who's in our film, who'd screened the film, and he said to Lynn, you know, I always saw the protests in the United States as a sign of our weakness. Now I see it as a sign of your strength. And that was an amazing admission that he lives in a repressive communist society in which he didn't even have the luxury of saying, hey, I don't think this war is right, or the way we're prosecuting this war is right, or something, without risking, imprisonment and potentially death. Whereas we know in our country, eventually a majority of American citizens realized the war wasn't worthwhile, or decided the war wasn't worthwhile and couldn't be won, and worked to end it through their elected representatives and their actions. So I love the fact that if we can rearrange the molecules of a North Vietnamese soldier, then we too ought to be able to, get out of our own hardened silos and begin to melt some of our own certainty about what we think happened, and the arguments that we're constantly, the old arguments that we're constantly, hanging on to, clinging to, and begin to listen to the other.
We've had an amazing 6 months or so, almost a little bit longer, traveling the country and sharing clips of the film with veterans, with Vietnamese Americans, with people who protested the war, and seeing the process of a little bit of reconciliation, at least conversation happening. And at an event we went to the other day, one of the veterans who's in the film was speaking, and afterwards a man came up to him and said, I'm from your same hometown. And he looked him right in the eye and he said, I didn't serve in the war. I thought it was wrong and I protested the war. And I stand by that, but I'm so sorry for what we said. And he just kept saying over and over, I'm sorry. He felt like it was really, we were overwhelmed watching this exchange. He just kept saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And the veteran, John Musgrave, he just said, it's okay, I understand.
We have not given space to these kinds of conversations over the last 42 years since the fall of Saigon. We have not permitted these kinds of conversations to have. In essence, we've allowed Thanksgivings to break down in arguments. We've had bar fights. We've had people who just won't talk about it. And now we have this opportunity to say, we're not so different. I made all the veterans stand up last night at an event, and then I had them remain standing and made all the people who had been involved in protesters stand up. And then I said, I can't tell the difference.
You answered like 4 of my questions in those statements, because that's one of the biggest things that I think of, is that this just was never worked out with our country, with each other. The reconciliation on many different levels, within communities, with the government, with the war itself. So
there's lots of reasons for that, and I think there is. I don't want to use the word blame, but I think a lot of things are responsible for that. Clearly, the protests and the things that were said towards the veterans contributed to that. I think the very nature of the war and a kind of lack of guiding principles from on top, the lack of transparency from the American government that made the risks that the soldiers were taking down at that combat level to be in question, where in World War II it wasn't in question why you might be sacrificing your life. I think just the way people were recruited and deployed and then returned home sort of all plowed towards a kind of loneliness that we now have to, by telling this story and by welcoming the veterans back and by asking them what we can do, can help to improve that.
There's also, profound questions that came up last night in our event with John McCain and John Kerry and Chuck Hagel about the draft and the way it worked, and who was in the military, who served and who didn't serve. And we had profound tensions, class differences, racial differences, ethnic differences, and there's enormous divides that kind of opened up in our society that were already there to some degree, but just got much wider during Vietnam. There was profound resentment about who did the fighting, who did the dying, who did the killing, who suffered the consequences. It wasn't evenly distributed. And we had a draft. You think that would mean that everybody was equally susceptible, but that's not how it worked. People got out of it legally and legitimately, and most young men who came of draft age did not serve. And so that caused resentment built in, just how it was organized by our government. And then we have also, something that came up again last night, which was failures of leadership. The people in charge, were they making the right decisions? And one of the veterans in the film, Carl Marlantes, he said, 18, 19-year-old soldiers will do what you ask. They make great soldiers. You train them and they will charge up that hill. They will do everything and more. And the responsibility is on the adults to make the right decisions and not waste those lives. And that was a huge question in Vietnam. And it came up in World War II as well. There were not every general didn't necessarily comport himself perfectly, but in Vietnam it became kind of systemic. And so that's something we also it's so painful, it's very difficult to reckon with. And we think our film helps just shed some light on the decisions that our leaders made and why, and what it was like for the soldiers who had to carry out those orders.
For good or for bad.
Well, that's the whole equation, calculus of war. I mean, and a lot of times it is for bad, and their mistakes are made, but I think because they're so pervasive in Vietnam, you don't like to get wounded in a hill you've already taken, retaking it.
Jumping to Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, what was going on in those White Houses? That White House?
You can't generalize, actually, so much. I mean, each one has their own particular story.
Right.
So it would be sort of reductive to really say what was going on in one sentence, but one thing you can say, and we've really discovered to our surprise, is that all those presidents were responsible in different ways. There was never a time when any of them felt with confidence that we would win this war. Never. They never had that sense, and there was always huge doubt about whether it was worth doing and achievable, and yet they continued to do it. And, partly it's the legacy of the last guy got me into this, and now I have to keep doing it. And then I don't think we can tell the American people we're not going to win this war. Will I get reelected? And then there's the sunk cost problem. People have died. People have sacrificed. So how do you tell the public, well, too bad? And it's an impossible situation, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And so we sort of see the story as this sort of series of decisions. We call them tragic decisions that, could we have avoided it here and here and here? And we keep on speeding down the track toward this train wreck, and it's hard to watch.
Parallels today. Having served in Afghanistan in 2009 and going in with one thought and leaving with another, questioning where does this go, to what end? Are we on that same path? Because you see, okay, you can count, as the American public can see, death tolls or counts or soldiers coming home, lost lives are lower, but there's a lot of moral injury, there's a lot of broken bodies.
So human beings are going to make the same mistakes human beings have always made from the beginning, from when there were human beings. And that's a kind of devastating realization. Mark Twain is supposed to say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think that the viewers of our film will see in the story of the Vietnam War a lot of events that rhyme in the present moment. Our job as filmmakers and historians is not to focus on that, to paint arrows about how isn't this a lot like Afghanistan, or isn't this, obsession with leaks a lot like the current president, or isn't this, stolen document, classified material very much like what went on. We're aware of that as we do it, but in no way do we want to alter it. We do understand that one of the positive byproducts of telling a complicated story well is that it does arm us in the present with a new perspective on the things that are besetting us, the moral and physical and actual mortal consequences of current struggles. And that if in any way the study of Vietnam, the absorption of what we've done after 10 years in the form of this documentary provides a veteran or provides anyone with some sense of perspective, then we've not only done a good job with that film, but we've also helped them and us try to come to terms with the complexity of our present moment.
So then when this releases, how do you block out the noise? How do you block out the noise that is the infotainment, the people that will grab pieces of this documentary to get their clicks, to get their follows, and not give the true perspective that is this immense, immersive documentary that you've produced?
I don't think we're so worried about that.
Yeah.
I think we feel people can digest it any way that they care to. It is at 10 parts, 18 hours. It's going to be available on broadcast and also streaming, and people can consume it in any which way they want. But we have also seen this kind of appetite for immersion and for a deep dive and for sort of being all-consuming and sharing this experience with people around you, whether it's Game of Thrones or Making a Murderer or Serial or any other kind of long-form nonfiction. There's a sense that people want a deep, complicated story that doesn't have any easy answers, and that's what we have, tried to put together. And people can watch it as they want, and we think from what we gather from many people who've seen pieces of it, they just sort of want to, it's like, okay, do you want to watch another episode? Yes. And so that's been happening, so we're not too worried about that.
The other night in Corpus Christi, Texas, which was hit incredibly hard by the hurricane, they had a screening of material from the film, an hour of stuff, and it was so emotional and cathartic, and it helped kind of reinforce the sense of the people in this indiscriminate storm. Nobody was spared. It provided them with an opportunity to sort of more firmly bind themselves to each other, and in a very positive way. That's what we hope happens with our films, what we know is the mission of public broadcasting. And so I think that there will always be people who will be happy to just take one little thing and say, aha, I got you. This is a controversial subject, but our film isn't controversial. And the only people who are going to find it so are the people who don't watch it. And we live in a media society, as you suggest, that is more than happy to pull an excerpt and be certain they understand what it is. And you can watch this film and there'll be moments that might be difficult from your point of view, political, moral, otherwise. And then another moment will be right in your wheelhouse, and then another moment that will have a big question mark over it. And that's the way a good narrative should be. And if you're just going to isolate that, which inevitably people will do, we don't really have a way to communicate other than say, we really would like you to watch the whole thing. We understand that it's a big demand, but those people who do watch it will benefit from the fact that they'll understand our motivations, they'll see that we didn't have an axe to grind, that we had no political agenda, and they'll realize that by absorbing it, they actually will be helping to forge the kind of communities that we feel, both real and psychological, that we feel we need and that are absent today. So there'll be lots of noise and lots of static, but the more important thing that we want to pay attention to is the person who came up and said, I watched the whole thing, I've got a question. I watched the whole thing, I need to tell you about my dad. I watched the whole thing, my mom said this. And that's where in America the rubber hits the road, not in the chatter that pushes everything around the plate.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add one more thing, because I think for soldiers or veterans watching our film, we made a great effort, as Ken said, to incorporate Vietnamese perspectives, Vietnamese soldiers on the losing side, the South Vietnamese, and on the winning side, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong. And it's been really interesting to see veterans who've seen the film here sort of lean in when the other side is speaking. And one of the huge lessons of Vietnam that we've been hearing over and over again from military experts and historians and people who lived through it is you have to know your enemy. And so we think our film gives anyone who wants to know a chance to understand who were we fighting, what were they fighting for, what was motivating them, how did they actually fight, how did they learn to combat our tactics and strategy, what were they willing to sacrifice, like Ken was saying.
A little bit late for our past, but very useful for our future.
Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, the Vietnam War. Awesome. Thank you both. Appreciate it.